March 22nd, 1945. The night is a study in profound silence and sharp, silvered moonlight over the old German town of Oppenheim. The Rhine River, a moving plain of ink-black water over 800 feet wide here, swollen to flood stage by the Alpine Spring, flows with a deep, cold current that has drowned armies for 2,000 years. On its western bank, nothing stirs that the German sentries can see or hear. No rumble of tanks massing, no telltale flash of artillery fire preparing the way, only the lapping of water against ancient stone. Then shadows begin to move. From concealed positions, American combat engineers slide 22-foot-long plywood and canvas assault boats into the swift current. The first men of the 5th Infantry Division, the Red Diamond, step aboard, their weapons and equipment muffled. They push off. The only sounds are the dip of paddles, the quiet urging of boat coxswains, and the relentless rush of the river that marks the last geographical barrier to the heart of the Third Reich. This is not the colossal, thunderous assault the German High Command expects. It is a ghost crossing. And its success would trigger not just a military crisis, but a profound psychological rupture deep within the Führerbunker in Berlin, revealing with stark, irrefutable clarity that the Reich had run out of time, resources, and finally, illusions. Understand the magnitude of the shock this silent crossing delivered. One must first appreciate the sacred totem the Rhine represented in the German psyche and strategic reality. For millennia, *der Rhein* had been more than a river. It was the Maginot Line of nature, the mythic border between civilization and wilderness, Rome and Germania. Julius Caesar had bridged it as a show of power, but Rome could never hold it. Napoleon's armies had crossed, but at great cost. In the grim calculus of March 1945, for a Reich reduced to a hollow shell, the Rhine was everything. Militarily, it was a defender's dream, wide, deep, fast, with steep banks on the German side, and every bridge from Switzerland to the Netherlands now a twisted wreck of German engineering. Politically, it was the last bastion behind which the myth of National Socialist resilience could be maintained. Propaganda had long spoken of the Festung Europa * Fortress Europe. By March, that fortress had been reduced to a single wet wall. Hitler and his inner circle believed that if they could force the Western Allies to a bloody D-Day-style stalemate at this river, precious time could be bought. Time for the mythical wonder weapons, the jet aircraft, the new U-boats to tip the balance. Time for the inevitable, fancied crack in the unnatural alliance between the capitalist West and the Bolshevik East. The Rhine, therefore, was not just a line on a map. It was the final stage upon which the drama of German destiny would be played out. This belief dictated the Allied response in the north. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the 21st Army Group, planned the kind of set-piece, overwhelming blow that the Germans anticipated and feared. Operation Plunder was a meticulously choreographed masterstroke involving over 1 million men, 10,000 artillery pieces, and a massive airborne component, Operation Varsity. It was to be a new Normandy, a brutal, undeniable application of force scheduled for March 23rd. Montgomery's philosophy was one of calculated, irresistible power. "We will cross the Rhine," he stated, "in such strength and with such violence that we will overcome all opposition." This was the anvil. But 200 miles to the south, a different kind of general was studying the river and the enemy with a predator's eye, seeing not a formidable barrier, but a panicked, brittle foe ripe for the taking. General George S. Patton, Jr., commanding the surging U.S. Third Army, was the antithesis of Montgomery's methodical preparation. Flamboyant, profane, and possessed of a ruthless, intuitive grasp of mobile warfare, Patton had spent March conducting a breathtaking campaign of annihilation west of the Rhine, his armored columns slicing through the Saar-Palatinate in what he called a blitzkrieg in reverse. In just 5 days, his forces captured 68,000 German prisoners evidence not of fierce resistance, but of systemic collapse. "The enemy is whipped," he wrote in his diary. "He just doesn't know it yet." To Patton, Montgomery's massive buildup was not just a strategic choice, it was a personal affront, a waste of time and, more grievously, American lives. He saw the Rhine not as a wall to be slowly scaled, but as a ditch to be jumped on the run. His superior, General Omar Bradley, shared this instinct. "Go ahead, George," Bradley told him, "take the Rhine on the run." Patton's plan for Oppenheim was an act of supreme military audacity, a violation of textbook doctrine that relied entirely on the element of surprise and his reading of German demoralization. Standard procedure for an assault river crossing called for a prolonged, crushing artillery bombardment, hours or even days of shelling to annihilate enemy positions, smash fortifications, and pin defenders in their bunkers. Patton ordered none of it. He would send his infantry across in darkness and silence, gambling that the Germans, expecting the thunder of Montgomery in the north, would be looking the wrong way. He selected the veteran 5th Infantry Division for the task, a unit he called one of the best, if not the best, division in the United States Army. Supporting them were 7,500 combat engineers and a bizarre but ingenious asset, U.S. Navy and Coast Guard landing craft, LCVPs and LCMs, veterans of Omaha and Utah beaches, which had been transporting hundreds of miles inland on tank transporters for exactly this purpose. The objective was simple, brutal, and typically Pattonian: get a foothold, expand it violently, and build bridges before the enemy could react. Speed was the only artillery preparation he needed. At 2200 hours on March 22nd, the first wave pushed off. The tension was electric. Men expected the sudden rip of machine gun fire, the crump of mortars, the nightmare of being trapped helplessly on the black water. It did not come. The boats ground onto the gravel of the east bank. Soldiers scrambled up the slope, expecting contact. They found only empty trenches and abandoned defensive works. The few German troops in the sector, elements of the depleted and scattered 159th Volksgrenadier Division, were asleep in cellars, their officers convinced no attack would come without the traditional earth-shaking preamble. Within 30 minutes, the 1st Battalion was across. Within 3 hours, over 3,500 men had established a beachhead a mile deep. The only resistance was sporadic, confused. The first serious German response came at dawn, a single artillery shell that scored a direct hit on a launching site, killing Navy Lieutenant, junior grade, Vincent A. Aiello, the operation's sole casualty. By then, it was far too late. The Navy's landing craft were already shuttling tanks and anti-tank guns across in a relentless growing stream. Combat engineers, working in 6-hour shifts under sporadic fire, began the Herculean task of constructing pontoon and treadway bridges. By nightfall on the 23rd, the bridgehead was 5 miles deep and 8 miles wide. Over 2,500 German soldiers had surrendered. American casualties stood at a miraculously low 42 dead and 151 wounded. Patton had done it. He had stolen a march not only on the Germans, but on history itself, crossing the Rhine one full day before Montgomery's monumental Operation Plunder even began. The news hit the Allied press with calculated timing, a deliberate thumb in the eye to British prestige. But the real reaction, the one that mattered, was unfolding 400 miles to the northeast, in the stifling, concrete-clad depths of the Reich Chancellery bunker in Berlin. Here, in a world of flickering map lights, stale air, and vibrating floors from near-constant Soviet air raids, Adolf Hitler received the report of the Oppenheim crossing. The atmosphere in the bunker was already a toxic brew of defiance and delusion. Hitler, his body trembling from Parkinson's-like symptoms, his face pale and waxy, survived on a cocktail of stimulants and fanatical belief. He clung to the pages of history, specifically to the story of Frederick the Great, during the 7 Years' War. In 1762, with his armies defeated and his resources exhausted, Frederick was saved from complete ruin by the miracle of the House of Brandenburg, the sudden death of the Russian Empress Elizabeth, which led her successor to withdraw from the anti-Prussian coalition. Hitler was convinced a similar geopolitical miracle would split the Allies. The Rhine was to be the stage for this deliverance. Its defense would buy the necessary time. The report from Oppenheim shattered this narrative. Unlike the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen 2 weeks earlier, which could be dismissed as a fluke, an engineering failure, this was different. This was a deliberate, successful assault crossing against a sector Germany knew was vulnerable. It was a statement of Allied capability and German weakness, written in cold, operational fact. Hitler's response was reflexive, a product of his entire military philosophy, counterattack asterisk. For years, this tactic had worked. In Russia, in the Ardennes, local counterattacks had stabilized crumbling fronts. His infamous "no retreat, no surrender" orders had, at times, forged desperation into a kind of strength. He turned to his staff, his voice rising with a fury that could not mask a creeping panic. He demanded an immediate, decisive counterblow to throw the American bridgehead into the river. The response he received from his military aides, relaying the stark assessment from Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's headquarters in the West, marked a watershed moment in the history of the Third Reich. It was not a request for resources or a debate over tactics. It was a simple, devastating statement of finality. Mein Führer, there are no reserves available. The words hung in the claustrophobic air. For the first time in the war, the master of the German Wehrmacht, the man who had summoned armies from the factories and youth of a continent, who had ordered offensives that stretched from the Volga to the Atlantic, could not command forces that did not exist. The cupboard was bare. The strategic reserve, that final pool of mobile divisions held back to plug gaps and launch decisive blows, had been utterly consumed. It had been bled white in the snows of Stalingrad, burned in the steel inferno of Kursk, squandered in the hopeless gamble of the Ardennes, and ground to dust in the retreat across France. What remained in the West were ghosts of divisions, understrength, under-equipped, immobile formations of old men from the Volkssturm and terrified boys from the Hitler Youth, stiffened by a handful of hardened but exhausted veterans. They had no fuel, little ammunition, and no air cover. They could die in place, but they could not mount a coordinated counter-offensive against a rapidly expanding American force, backed by overwhelming artillery and total air supremacy. This admission was more than a military briefing, it was the lifting of a veil. In that moment, the war transitioned from a dire but possibly manageable crisis to an inescapable terminal condition. The Führer's will, the very engine of the Nazi state, had met an immovable object, arithmetic. The psychological impact on Hitler was profound. According to aides like General Alfred Jodl, he fell into a stunned, vacant silence before the rage returned. A rage now directed not at the Allies, but at his own military, at the traitors and defeatists, who he believed had failed him through lack of will, not lack of men. He began issuing a series of fantastical, disconnected orders, directing phantom panzer divisions to counterattack, ordering Luftwaffe squadrons that existed only on paper into the air, commanding units already annihilated to hold ground to the last man. The link between the command bunker and battlefield reality had been severed. While Hitler raged against the specter of betrayal, his most loyal apostle of lies was forced to confront the crumbling truth. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, the man who had spun defeat at Stalingrad into an epic of heroic sacrifice, received the news in his own bunker office. His diary, that remarkable record of narcissism and cynicism, captures the seismic shift. On March 24th, just 2 days after Oppenheim, he wrote, "The situation in the West has entered an extraordinarily critical, indeed almost deadly phase. The enemy now stands on German soil on a broad front. The Rhine as a defensive barrier has been lost. For Goebbels, the master manipulator of perception, this was an admission of catastrophic failure. The Rhine was not just a river, it was the central pillar of his final propaganda narrative. He had been preparing the German people for the Battle of the Rhine, promising a fortress that would drown the enemy in German blood and will. Now, that fortress had been breached in silence, almost casually. His diary entries from these days reveal a fascinating, almost schizophrenic duality. One entry coolly analyzes the military disaster. Allied air supremacy is total, German mobility is zero, the Ruhr industrial heartland is about to be encircled. The next entry clutches at the same straws as Hitler. Fervent prayers for a miracle, lengthy discourses on the lessons of Frederick the Great, bitter condemnations of the German people themselves for their lack of fanaticism. He was particularly incensed by reports of white flags appearing in villages ahead of the American advance. The people, in his view, were failing the leadership, not the other way around. This cognitive dissonance, the clear-eyed recognition of doom paired with a desperate, almost religious faith in a turn of fortune, defined the bunker's final days. The crossing at Oppenheim had not just broken a defensive line, it had broken the final, sustainable lie. With the dam breached, the collapse was rapid and systemic. Patton, smelling total victory, executed not one, but 3 more assault crossings in the following week, at Boppard on March 25th, at St. Goar on the 26th, and at Mainz on the 28th. Each followed the Oppenheim model, swift, silent, and successful against collapsing resistance. To the north, Montgomery's colossal Operation Plunder went off as planned on the 23rd, a spectacular and successful application of brute force that now seemed, in the context of Patton's easy leaps, almost gratuitous. The Allies now had multiple, unshakable bridgeheads. The war west of the Rhine was over. 300,000 German soldiers were captured in the Rhineland pocket. The war east of the Rhine became a pursuit. The strategic implications were immediate and devastating. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial furnace, was now encircled by early April, trapping Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B, over 300,000 men, in what became known as the Ruhr Pocket. Its systematic destruction eliminated the last major source of German war production. More critically, the Operational Initiative passed irrevocably to the Allies. German commanders, hamstrung by Hitler's stand and die orders and devoid of reserves, could no longer form a coherent front. They could only watch as Allied armored columns, led by scouts in jeeps, raced down autobahns and country lanes, meeting resistance that was sporadic, localized, and quickly overwhelmed. The Wehrmacht's famed discipline and cohesion, which had held through years of retreat, began to dissolve. Soldiers, seeing the futility of dying for a lost cause, surrendered in droves. In some units, hardened veterans prevented fanatical Nazi officers from carrying out fight to the last orders, knowing it meant massacre. The will to resist, the Kampfwillen that Nazi ideology prized above all, was evaporating. Patton's Third Army became the spearhead of this explosive advance, a force of pure, unchecked momentum. He captured Frankfurt on March 29th. By mid-April, his columns were slicing through Bavaria and charging toward Czechoslovakia. It was during this headlong rush that his troops began to uncover the hidden horror of the regime they were destroying, the concentration camps. Patton himself was among the first senior Allied commanders to witness the unspeakable conditions at Ohrdruf, a sub-camp of Buchenwald, on April 12th. The hardened general, who had seen every facet of battlefield carnage, was physically sickened. He immediately ordered that every unit in the area be marched through the camp. "See that?" he reportedly growled to his aides. "That is what we are fighting against." The moral clarity of the mission, now stripped of any lingering abstraction, fused with the military triumph. Back in Berlin, the world was contracting to the dimensions of a concrete tomb. The news from the Rhine had been the definitive stroke. The Soviet storm was now audible from the bunker. The Western Allies were racing through Germany unchecked. Hitler's conferences became tortured exercises in managing catastrophe. He issued orders for armies that were a LRE, a DY Chinese letter, for attacks by aircraft that had no fuel, for relief by SS divisions that existed only in his imagination. The no reserves revelation had broken the last thread of strategic possibility. All that remained was the Wagnerian final act, destruction. On April 30th, with Soviet soldiers less than 500 yards from the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler took his own life. The miracle of the House of Brandenburg never came. The river that was to be Germany's salvation had instead become the runway for its doom. The unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, came just 6 weeks after those first plywood boats slipped into the water at Oppenheim. In the end, Patton's silent crossing proved more than a tactical masterstroke. It served as the ultimate diagnostic of the Third Reich's terminal condition. It demonstrated that German military power was not just weakened, but exhausted, that its leadership was trapped in a prison of delusion, and that its ideological fervor could not withstand the cold, hard reality of total strategic bankruptcy. The reaction in the bunker, the stunned silence following no reserves, was the true sound of the Reich's end, not the thunder of bombs or the roar of artillery, but the quiet, dreadful acknowledgement that there was nothing left. The ghost crossing had exposed a ghost army defending a ghost empire, commanded by a man who was now only a ghost of his former self. The Rhine, the ancient guardian, had fallen not with a bang, but with a whisper, and in that whisper, Hitler and his Reich heard their own oblivion.